Today we're going to be talking about Mendelian genetics. Most of y'all should be familiar with this as you saw this in 7th grade. Mendelian genetics, keyword being gene, which is talking about your DNA. So when we look at genetics, there are two different types, your genotype and your phenotype. The first type that we're going to be talking about is your genotype. So genotype, emphasis on the geno coming from gene, is a genetic makeup of an organism based off of the alleles inherited from each parent. So since they're talking about each parent, we know that each person is going to have two alleles because you get two exact copies for the same gene, one from your mother and one from your father. So when you look here below, you see that there are three different combinations. One of the combinations has two capital letters, meaning that they are homozygous dominant. Homo meaning the same and dominant because they are capitalized. The second type is heterozygous. Hetero meaning different because you have one capital and one lowercase. Then the last one, you see that there are two lowercase letters here, which is homozygous recessive. Recessive because they are both lowercase and homo because they are the same. Now if you notice, whenever you see a capital letter, that is designated as a dominant trait. A lowercase letter is designated as a recessive trait. As you can see from the Punnett square above, that the only way to show the recessive trait, which in this case would be a white flower, is when both alleles are coding for a recessive trait. If a capital letter is present, regardless whether it's in a homozygous dominant form or in a heterozygous, the organism will still show the dominant trait, because dominant traits always dominate over the recessive. So continuing on, we can see that each allele, whether it be capitalized or lowercase, designates whether a trait is dominant or recessive. As we learned in the previous slide, that dominant traits are designated by a capital letter and recessive traits are designated by a lowercase. Now, depending on the combination of your genotype, that will influence your phenotype. So phenotype is the second thing that we're going to learn. So P for pheno, physical. So phenotype is a physical characteristic that is determined by the combination of the alleles. It is the trait or the protein produced by the genotype. So we learned when we were talking about DNA, how DNA goes to mRNA, mRNA to protein. Well, this is the same process that's occurring. The genotype, which would be your gene, is designating what your phenotype would be. In this case, the protein produced to show that physical trait or physical characteristic. So in this case, having a capital P codes for purple, while a lowercase p codes for white. Now, as you can see in the chart, in the top three examples, when they're homozygous dominant and when they're heterozygous, each of those genotypes contains a capital letter, meaning that the phenotype is going to demonstrate the dominant trait, which in this case would be purple. If you see in the homozygous here, both of them are recessive, indicating that the flower will show white or the recessive trait. So you can see that the chart here on the bottom is showing you and telling you why when they're homozygous dominant shows purple. Heterozygous still shows purple, but because the dominant trait, which is the capital P, is overriding the recessive. When they're homozygous recessive, there is no dominant trait available to override the recessive, so the recessive allele is able to show. So here's one example in which I have combined everything you just learned. So we can see here that a capital A is designating red being the dominant color, while a lowercase a is designating blue as the recessive. Now you can see that in this picture you have two different birds, a red one and a blue one. Now, since the red one here, we are seeing that there are two capital letters, so then the dad in this case is homozygous dominant, since they are both the same letter, while the mother is homozygous recessive. Now we can see that the mother is a blue bird. So blue is only being shown because both alleles that she has are lowercase, which are going to code for the recessive trait. Now, when they set up the Punnett square, you always want to keep the alleles from one parent and the alleles from the second parent together, as you can see in the example to the left. Now, when I look at my genotype that I'm looking at is looking at my offspring, which is what I'm seeing here in these 4 boxes. So this capital A will come down, and then this lowercase a will come across. Same thing, down and across, down and across, down and across, until all 4 boxes have 2 alleles, one coming from the father and one from the mother. Now you can see that in all 4 boxes, we contain 1 capital and 1 lowercase, meaning that 100% of my offspring will come out heterozygous for their genotype. Homozygous dominant is 0% and homorecessive 0% as well. Now, although 100% of them are going to be heterozygous, we can see that 100% of them are going to show red. So even though all 4 of these offspring contain a lowercase, none of them will show blue, because the dominant trait, which is red in this case, is going to overwrite the blue. So when we look at our phenotype is only looking at the 2 possible traits, red and blue. 100% showing red because all 4 children contain a capital letter. 0% blue because none of the 4 children in the Punnett square contain 2 lowercase a's.